They gave her a crown. Then they broke it over her spine and made her sweep up the pieces. Queen Seraphine of House Kaelor, born from bloodlines older than the empire itself, reduced to pouring wine for the woman sleeping in her bed. Every wolf in that hall watched. Not one moved. You want to know what real power looks like? It doesn't roar, it doesn't beg. It waits. Stay until the end. Hit that like. Drop your city below. Because what happens next? Nobody survives it the same way twice. Man. The mud had dried on her ceremonial gown by the time the gates opened. Seraphine knew by the sound, the particular groan of iron on stone, that she had memorized in 6 years of living inside those walls. Exactly how many seconds she had before the grand hall filled. 43. She had counted once, bored during a winter feast, watching vapor drift from the torch brackets while Draven held court over something she had already decided did not matter. She used all 43 of them standing perfectly still beneath the throne dais, one hand pressed flat against the stone pillar beside her, feeling the cold travel up through her palm and settle somewhere behind her sternum where the cold already lived permanently. The mud on her gown was from the execution yard. She had not gone there willingly. 2 of Draven's house guards had escorted her at dawn, not roughly, which was almost worse than roughness, because roughness at least would have been honest, and positioned her near the outer wall where she could witness the hanging of Lord Fenwick's 3rd son, a boy of 19 who had apparently spoken too freely about the king's recent military failures in the eastern passes. The boy had looked at her once before they put the hood over his face. She had not looked away. She owed him that much. The mud had splattered from the drop. Now she stood beneath the dais with it drying on silver silk, and the hall filled around her like water rising in a sealed room. The nobles of House Kaelor arrived in their usual configurations. Old Lord Casimir with his gout and his 3 young attendants who carried his meaning for him across rooms. The Bryn sisters, inseparable since birth and poisonous as paired blades. High Steward Vorin, who had served 4 kings and survived each one by understanding which direction the wind was turning approximately 6 weeks before anyone else admitted there was a wind at all. Seraphine watched Vorin take his position near the left wall, noted the particular set of his shoulders, and filed it away. She watched everything. She had learned to watch because watching cost nothing and revealed everything. And in a court where every resource available to her had been systematically reduced over the past 8 months, observation remained the one currency they had not yet figured out how to confiscate. 8 months since Evelisa. 4 months since Draven had stopped visiting her chambers entirely. 6 weeks since he had stopped acknowledging her presence in public spaces unless protocol demanded it, and even then only barely, his gaze skating across her face like she was a portrait he had grown tired of. The hall doors opened wide. Draven entered. He was still physically impressive. She had never been able to take that from him honestly, and she was committed to honesty with herself even when it was inconvenient. Tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that convinced men he was stronger than he actually was, and convinced women of things that were not strictly true either. His dark ceremonial coat was new. She recognized the cut. Evelise had redesigned the royal wardrobe 3 months ago, a quiet restructuring that most of the court had pretended not to notice, and Seraphine had pretended alongside them because the moment you acknowledged a replacement had begun redecorating, you acknowledged you were the thing being replaced. Evelise walked beside him. Crimson velvet, moonstone jewels across her collarbone, her wrists threaded through the dark, elaborate architecture of her hair. She wore triumph the way other women wore perfume, as something applied deliberately, with an audience in mind. Her smile as she entered the grand hall was the smile of someone who had practiced it until it looked natural, and it almost did. Almost. Seraphine watched the smile and noted the 6 millimeters of tension at the corner of Evelise's left eye. Not as easy as you expected, is it? She kept the thought entirely internal. She kept everything internal these days. The court was a hall of mirrors, and every expression she showed them became a weapon they sharpened and returned to her later. Draven seated Evelise beside the throne. The hall fell silent. The way rooms fell silent when something unspeakable occurred in a place where speaking was the primary commerce. A total cessation, every conversation cutting off mid-syllable, every wine cup paused halfway to every mouth. In the silence, Seraphine breathed in slowly through her nose. She smelled torch oil, beeswax, The particular animal undercurrent that large gatherings of wolves always carried beneath their perfumes and pretensions. The reminder that underneath the silk and the political maneuvering, they were all still creatures who had once killed with their hands. She did not cry. She had not cried since the third week after Ivelisse arrived, when she had cried alone in the bathhouse at 2 a.m. with the water running loud enough to cover the sound, and then she had sat with it for an hour afterward, examining it carefully, the way you examined a wound to determine whether it was the kind that healed or the kind that infected. She had decided she could not afford the kind that infected. She had decided she could not afford crying in places where the evidence might be observed, interpreted, reported. The wolves of this court fed on visible wounds. "Luna!" Draven's voice crossed the hall without effort. 6 years of ruling had given him a voice that filled rooms without shouting, which had been one of the first things she had found compelling about him, back when compulsion still lived in her chest rather than this flat, pragmatic coldness. "Bring wine to our guest." Our guest. Seraphine moved to the service table along the eastern wall. She was aware of every set of eyes in the room tracking her, assessing, measuring. She was aware of the whispers beginning behind cupped hands and wine cups tilted at strategic angles. She picked up the decanter, good glass, House Valor's own vintage from the cellars below the east wing, a cellar she had personally overseen the restocking of 3 years ago, and she walked across the grand hall toward the throne dais. The goblet trembled slightly as she poured, not from weakness. She needed people to understand that, though she could not tell them. The trembling was not weakness. It was the specific physical manifestation of restraint, the shaking of a hand that was choosing actively, moment by moment, not to do the thing it most wanted to do, which was to pour the wine over Ivelisse's elaborate hair and the moonstone jewels and the crimson triumph and watch, all of it run down into the throne where it did not belong. Ivelisse accepted this cup without looking at her directly, which was its own performance, Seraphine recognized. The performance of someone so thoroughly victorious that the defeated party no longer merited the effort of eye contact. "The vintage is acceptable," Seraphine said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. Ivelisse took a long sip, held it, swallowed with visible deliberation. "Adequate," she said finally. "Though I find the cellars here run somewhat thin. I've written to the Eastern Vineyards for a better arrangement." "The Eastern Vineyards have supplied this house for 40 years. "Yes." Ivelisse smiled at some point past Seraphine's left shoulder. "And they'll supply it for 40 more, under better management." Seraphine set the decanter down on the small table beside the throne dais. She straightened. She looked at Draven, looked at him directly, which she had not done in weeks because looking at him directly still cost her something, still pulled at something in the deep architecture of her chest that she had not yet fully dismantled, and she resented that cost, resented it with a purity of feeling that clarified everything around it. Draven met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked away. Seraphine turned and walked back across the grand hall. She was aware, as she walked, of High Steward Vorin watching her with that particular careful attention he reserved for things he was not yet sure were dangerous. She filed that away too. She thought, he ruled through strength once, 6 years ago, 3 years ago even. She had watched him in war councils, watched him read maps and move armies and make the kind of decisions that cost thousands of lives and were right anyway. And she had understood then what an alpha in full command of himself looked like. The particular quality of attention, the stillness before movement, the sense of weight and consequence that came off him like heat from banked coals. She looked at him now, redirecting his court's attention toward Ivelisse's complaints about the vintage. While border reports sat unopened in the war room, she was no longer permitted to enter, and she thought, this is not strength. This is someone performing the memory of strength. This is someone who has stopped doing the thing and started imitating the residue of the thing. And she thought, fear is patient. She thought, every crack starts somewhere. She thought nothing that she showed on her face, and she returned to her position along the wall, and she waited. The formal stripping of her royal sigils happened on a Tuesday. No ceremony. That was the particular cruelty of it. There was no occasion arranged, no ritual that might have given her the dignity of something acknowledged. High Steward Vorin arrived at her chambers in the East Wing at dawn. Not her chambers anymore, technically. She had been relocated 3 weeks prior to the old guest quarters near the servants' stairwell, and he stood in her doorway with a document in his hand and the expression of a man performing a task he found distasteful, but not distasteful enough to refuse. By order of the king, Vorin said, the royal seals, signet ring, and house crest items currently held by the former Luna are to be returned to the treasury. Former. She had been expecting it. She had been expecting it so precisely that when she turned from the window and looked at him, she felt almost nothing. A slight drop in temperature somewhere behind her ribs, a narrowing of focus, the animal brain cataloging the information and filing it under. Confirmed, proceed accordingly. The former Luna, she repeated. Vorin's jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. He was a man who revealed himself in millimeters. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Just those 2 words, not attached to anything official, not for the document or the record, just said into the space between them. She looked at him for a moment. Are you? She said. Not unkindly. With genuine curiosity, actually, because it seemed important to know whether the apology was real or reflexive. Vorin looked at the floor, which was answer enough. She removed the signet ring herself, did not make him ask twice, did not extend the discomfort into theater, and placed it in his open hand. She removed the 2 remaining house crest brooches from the cloak hung by the door. She gathered the seals from the writing desk. She placed them all in his hands with the calm efficiency of someone who had already grieved these particular objects in private and had no grief left to perform publicly. Tell me something, she said as he turned to leave. He stopped. The eastern border reports, Clan Ashvar's movements in the Thornfeld Valley. Has anyone actually read them? A pause. A long one, during which Vorin's shoulders did something complicated. The king has been occupied. The king has been occupied for 4 months, Seraphine said. Clan Ashvar has been moving for 3. The math on that is not favorable, Vorin. He did not answer. He left. She stood in the doorway of the guest quarters near the servants' stairwell and watched him go, and then she turned back to her stripped-down room and thought, when it falls, it will fall fast. That is always how these things go. Not slowly and then quickly. Just quickly. And then it was gone. She sat at the writing desk, no seals on it now, nothing official, just her own hands on plain wood, and she began to think in earnest about what she still had. Not royal sigils, not access to war councils, not her chambers, not her servants, not her formal title, not the political alliances that had dissolved over the past months like salt in warm water as the court recalibrated toward whatever future it perceived Draven and Evelise as representing. She had her name, her bloodline, which no document could remove. The information she had been systematically collecting for 8 months of watching everything. A handful of lords in the outer provinces who had written to her quietly in the old cipher she and Draven had used in the first year of their marriage. Before he had stopped reaching for things like ciphers and private communications and started performing kingship from the center of a room. And she had herself. The particular instrument of herself which had not yet been broken, which she was not going to allow to be broken, because she understood by now that the only asset she possessed that they could not confiscate was the quality of her own mind and the iron that had apparently always lived in her chest, waiting for sufficient pressure to reveal it. She began to make a list. Not on paper. Never on paper anymore. Not in this room near the servants' stairwell where anyone might enter and the document might be found. She made the list in the architecture of her memory, in the orderly interior space she had been expanding and organizing for months, the way a general quietly maps terrain before the army arrives. She was halfway through the list when the door opened without a knock. She did not turn immediately. She finished the thought she was in the middle of, placed it correctly, and then she turned. It was Lady Mira Colfin, one of Evelise's attending women, a thin, angular girl of perhaps 22 who carried cruelty the way adolescents sometimes carried borrowed accessories, with more enthusiasm than skill, not yet understanding the weight of the thing she was wielding. "You're wanted in the lower hall," Mira said. "Lady Evelise requires attendance for the afternoon reception." Seraphine looked at the girl with the flat, assessing attention she now deployed in all human interactions as a first response rather than a last. She catalogued. The slight flush of satisfaction in Mira's face, The way she had not bothered to use a title or any address at all. The fact that she was enjoying this delivery enough that her right hand was making a small unconscious fist against her skirt. Required attendance, Seraphine said. That's what I said. And you were sent specifically? Not another of her women? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mira's face, brief and quickly suppressed. I was available. She was not available. She had volunteered. Seraphine recognized the difference. The difference between a task assigned and a task sought out for the specific pleasure of its delivery. Tell Lady Evelis I'll attend directly, Seraphine said. Mira left with her small fist still clenched. Seraphine stood, smoothed her plain wool dress. They had not replaced the wardrobe they had removed, which was its own category of calculated diminishment, making her visible in her reduction to every court member who encountered her, and walked to the cracked mirror above the writing desk. She looked at herself for a long moment. The woman looking back at her had faint shadows under her eyes from not sleeping enough, and eating too little, and spending too many hours in the dark internal space where the strategizing happened. Her cheekbones had sharpened. Her expression had lost whatever softness had once lived there, not gradually, but in specific increments, each one corresponding to a particular event, a particular morning when she had stood in some new configuration of humiliation and chosen, again, to feel it later and survive it now. She looked, she thought, like something that had been through a process. She thought, good, let them see that. She went to the lower hall. The accusation came at the first frost. She had known something was coming, had felt it in the changed quality of attention directed at her over the preceding 2 weeks. A subtle increase in surveillance dressed up as social interaction. Various court members inserting themselves into her daily routine with a naturalness that was just slightly too deliberate. Someone had decided to move. She had not known in which direction. She knew in the great council chamber, standing before Draven and 40 lords, hearing herself described as a traitor. The charge was conspiracy with Clan Ashvar. She almost laughed. She controlled it completely. It never reached her face. But internally she felt the dark absurdity of it wash through her like cold water. Clan Ashvar. The very movement she had been trying to get someone, anyone in this blind, self-consuming court, to pay attention to for 3 months. The man delivering the charge was Lord Casimir's second son, Baron, a young man of 30 with his father's instinct for political positioning and none of his father's patience for subtlety. He stood before the council with a document in his hand and spoke with the particular confident speed of someone who has rehearsed. Intercepted correspondence, Baron said, between the former Luna and Ashvar's war chief Drevnak indicates a prearranged agreement exchanging intelligence on border garrison positions for safe conduct and future territorial recognition. The chamber was very quiet. Seraphine stood at the center of it in her plain wool dress with her sharpened face and her 8 months of compressed and organized fury, and she looked at Draven. Draven sat at the head of the council table. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the document Baran had placed before him, or performing the act of looking at it, and she watched his jaw work slightly, and she understood immediately from that small movement that he knew the charge was fabricated, and he was choosing to proceed anyway. That was the moment something completed in her. Not broke. Completed. The way a blade completes in the final stage of tempering, through the last application of sufficient heat, achieving its final permanent form. "My Lord King," she said. He looked up. "I'd like to respond to the charge." A pause. Protocol required it. Even here, even now, stripped of title and sigils and chambers, she was still technically owed a response under the old legal forms that Draven had not yet gotten around to formally dismantling, which was one of the several administrative oversights resulting from spending 4 months primarily occupied with Evelis rather than governance. "Speak," he said. "The correspondence is fabricated," she said. "The cipher used is a corrupted version of the Eastern trade script, corrupted specifically in the 3rd quadrant of the encoding table, which has been incorrect in House Vaelor's forgery workshop for approximately 18 months. I discovered the error myself. I reported it to High Steward Vorin in writing." She turned her eyes to Vorin, who was sitting very still along the eastern wall. "He can confirm that." Silence. Baron's confident speed had evaporated. He stood holding his document looking slightly younger than 30. Draven looked at Vorin. Vorin looked at the table. "Furthermore," Seraphine continued, If the Council would like to examine Clan Ashvar's actual current movements, which I have been attempting to place before this Council for the past 11 weeks, you will find that their activity pattern is entirely consistent with a coordinated destabilization effort targeting the Southern Trade Corridor, which has nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that Lord Fenwick's 3 remaining border garrisons have been understaffed since the spring redeployment. She stopped. The chamber was very quiet in a different way than it had been before. Draven's expression had gone through several iterations. She watched them with the dispassionate attention she had developed for reading him. Watched the flash of something that might have been, in another man, in a different version of this man. Something like recognition, something like the particular pain of seeing clearly a person you have treated badly and finding them more formidable than your treatment acknowledged. It lasted perhaps 1 second, then his expression closed. "The charge stands pending investigation," he said. "The former Luna is confined to quarters pending resolution." Baron looked relieved. Seraphine nodded once, a minimal movement, no more acknowledgement than the moment demanded, and she left the chamber with 2 guards flanking her and the back of her neck prickling with the particular awareness of eyes following a person who has just made themselves inconvenient in a way that does not resolve quietly. She thought, the investigation will not happen. She thought, something else will happen instead. She was right. They came for her at midnight. Not dramatically, not with force. 4 guards and an official document citing concerns for her well-being during the pending investigation, authorizing temporary relocation to the outer settlement near the Black Fang frontier for purposes of security and impartial oversight. Seraphine read the document twice in the torchlight. She noted the signature. Not Draven's hand, she knew Draven's hand, had read thousands of words in it across 6 years, including the early ones that had been worth reading. This was a copy of his signature, well done. The kind of copy that required access to official documents and practice, and a particular sort of intimate familiarity with the original. She filed the information. She dressed without being told to hurry, put on her warmest things, which were not warm enough. They had not replaced her winter wardrobe either. And she walked out of the guest quarters near the servants' stairwell, between 4 guards, and through the back passages of House Kaelor toward the outer gates. She walked through rooms she had lived in for 6 years. She looked at each one, not with sentimentality, with the focused, deliberate attention of someone committing a place to memory for strategic purposes rather than emotional ones. The kitchen passage, the lower armory corridor, the old records annex, the covered walkway where she had sat with Draven on the second night she had ever spent inside these walls, back when he had still been trying to convince her of things rather than simply expecting them. She looked at the covered walkway as she passed it. She did not slow. The gates opened. Cold air hit her face with the immediate force of something honest. The frontier winter did not perform, did not manage impressions, just arrived and was what it was, which she found she preferred. The guards indicated a horse, a single horse, not well provisioned. She mounted without comment. The gates closed behind her. She rode north. The cold was different from anything she had prepared herself for, and she had prepared herself extensively. By the 4th hour, her hands had moved past pain into the numb mechanical state where she could still use them, but could not feel them using themselves. And she had begun the internal accounting that survival conditions required, what she had, what she could reasonably expect ahead, what the variables were, which variables she could influence and which she could not. She had a horse. She had the horse's warmth as long as they were moving. She had the thick wool outer layer she'd had the foresight to put on, which was not enough, but was something. She had the information in her head, the entire 8 months of it, organized and intact. She had the names of the 3 outer province lords who had written to her in the old cipher. She had approximately 40 miles of frontier wasteland between her current position and the nearest settlement that might reasonably be expected not to report her immediately to the crown. She was cold and alone, and she had been formally accused of treason and exiled without trial from the house she had built alongside a man who had once told her, with a conviction she had believed absolutely, that she was the only person he had ever trusted completely. She thought about that, riding north through the dark. She did not think about it with grief. She had grief, but she had also been doing the ongoing process of converting grief into fuel for some months now, and the conversion had gotten efficient. She felt it briefly, like touching something hot, and then she put it to work. She thought instead, he was right. He did trust me completely once. That was not a lie. The man who told her that was not a fiction. He just stopped being that man. And she thought, I have to stop asking why. Why is not useful information out here? Out here, the useful information is north and warmth and distance, and the particular sound a horse's breathing makes when it is beginning to labor, which is the sound hers was beginning to make, which meant she needed to slow and rest them both before she lost the animal entirely. She pulled up in the shelter of a rock outcropping and dismounted with the careful economy of someone managing numb hands and extremities, got the horse's blanket from the saddle pack, covered the animal, pressed herself against its side for shared warmth, and looked up. Stars, out here away from the palace torchlight, were a different order of thing entirely. Dense and indifferent and breathtaking in the way that indifferent things could sometimes be breathtaking, by their simple commitment to existing on their own terms regardless of what was happening below them. She leaned her head back against the horse's neck. She thought someone in that palace knows the signature was forged. Several someones, probably. Baron Casimir. Evelise certainly. Possibly Draven, and possibly Draven deliberately chose not to know. She thought, the border garrisons are understaffed. She thought, by spring, if nothing changes, 3 of the southern trade routes will be effectively controlled by Ashvar. She thought, when the Empire starts bleeding, they will need someone who understands the wound, and there will be no one left inside those walls who does. She did not think this with satisfaction. She was not capable of finding satisfaction in the suffering of people who had not wronged her. The soldiers at those garrisons, the merchants on those trade routes, the ordinary residents of the territories that would bear the cost of this specific political blindness. But she thought it because it was true, and truth out here felt like one of the only navigational tools she had. She remounted after an hour. She rode north. She found the ruins at dawn, which might have been mercy from some impersonal universe, or might have simply been the math of how far she had ridden and where the frontier's old battlefields were mapped. She chose to interpret it practically rather than symbolically, because she was her father's daughter, and her father had always said that people who interpreted their survival as cosmically significant were people who spent too much time congratulating themselves and not enough time evaluating their next move. The ruins of the Battle of Greyhorn Pass. She had read about it, had studied the frontier's military history the year she became Luna, methodically, because the eastern borders were a strategic concern, and she had believed then that her role included understanding the strategic concerns of the house she now led. The Battle of Greyhorn Pass, 70 years prior. 6 Alpha Kings. 3 of them died here. The other 3 were never the same afterward. Shattered statues, broken stone, old weapons that had rusted into the ground so thoroughly they had become ground. Snow over all of it, smoothing the evidence of catastrophe into something almost peaceful. She was so cold she was making small, involuntary sounds with each exhale. Not crying, not quite, but the body doing something beyond her control management, just the raw animal of her responding to temperature. Her horse had stopped of its own accord and was standing with its head down near a half-collapsed pillar, and she slid off its back and sat against the pillar with her knees pulled up and her arms tight around herself, and she breathed. In, out. She was not going to die here. She had decided this explicitly, consciously, framed it as a decision rather than a hope, because hope was passive and decisions were active, and she was not capable of passivity, not now, not after everything. She was not going to die here. She did not know how she was not going to die here. She sat with that for approximately 4 minutes, which was honest and necessary, and then she began, again, making the list. She was deep inside the list, had reached the section concerning Voron's probable response timeline to the forged signature discovery, assuming discovery happened within the next 30 days, and what that might mean for the 3 Outer Province lords in terms of their willingness to act. When she heard the sound. Not her horse. Her horse was still head down near the pillar, making its own quiet calculations about warmth and fatigue. A different sound. Multiple horses. Moving with the particular controlled discipline of riders who knew how to travel quietly and were choosing to allow themselves to be heard, announcing presence without announcing urgency, which was a specific skill that belonged to a specific category of rider. She did not stand immediately. She did not run. Running in these ruins in this cold on these legs would accomplish nothing except to demonstrate exactly how reduced she was, and she had made a practice of not demonstrating her reductions. She stood, slowly, deliberately, turned to face the sound. They came out of the gray dawn light, 6 riders in unmarked black, horses massive and well-provisioned, the kind of animals that ate better than most frontier settlements. Their breath and their horses' breath made a small cloud in the cold. They stopped 20 feet from her and sat their horses without any apparent urgency, and she looked at them and they looked at her. And then the riders parted, creating a channel, and through the channel came one more rider. He was larger than she expected, which was saying something because she had expected large. She had heard the descriptions, had read the intelligence reports that made it through the war room during the months she still had access, had absorbed the accounts of everyone who had encountered Kaelor Thorne and returned to tell about it. The Supreme Alpha, the Varinth bloodline, the man who had consolidated the northern territories through a combination of absolute military precision and the particular quality of personal authority that made people comply before they had consciously decided to comply. The descriptions had not been wrong. They had just been incomplete. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older, with the kind of weathered quality that came from spending large portions of your life outdoors in serious weather, and dark hair that had clearly not been arranged for this or any other occasion. He wore riding armor without any insignia that she could identify, which was either modesty or its own kind of confidence. The confidence of a man who did not require visible markers because there was nothing present that might be confused with him. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her. She looked at him directly. She was not going to look at the ground. She was not going to shrink. She was standing in ruins with frost in her hair and a plain wool dress and nothing. No title, no sigils, no army, no negotiating position that anyone rational would describe as favorable. And she was going to look at him directly because she had decided some time ago that the last thing they would take from her was the ability to meet eyes. He looked back at her. His eyes were very still. Not cold. She had expected cold and found instead a particular quality of attention that reminded her, in a way she did not immediately have language for, of something she had once observed in a very old wolf at the edge of the Kaelor forest years ago. An animal that had survived long enough and experienced enough to have moved past reactivity into something else, something slower and more certain and far more dangerous. The silence stretched out. She counted 8 seconds of it before he spoke. "You're further from the palace than I expected," he said. His voice was even, not especially deep, but with a quality of density to it, like words that had been selected carefully and then delivered without the anxious excess of someone who was not sure they'd been heard. "I had a horse," she said, "and a reason." "1 horse," he said. "No provisions worth mentioning. Frontier temperature at 2 before dawn." He looked at her with that still attention. "You were going to die out here." "I had decided not to." Something shifted in his expression, very small. Not a smile exactly, the precursor of a smile suppressed before completion, the way you suppress something that surprised you before you'd had time to determine whether the surprise was welcome. "Decided," he repeated. "I find it more reliable than hoping." He looked at her for another moment. Then he dismounted. Just swung down from that massive horse with the casual economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and did not think about it. And he landed in the snow 3 feet from her, and he was taller than she had calibrated for, and he did not adjust his distance, and she did not adjust hers. "Kaelor Thorne," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "And you are Seraphine of House Kaelor." "Former," she said. "Apparently." Again that micro-expression, something moving beneath the surface of a face that had developed through long practice an efficient system for not showing things. "Former," he said. "By whose authority?" "A forged signature and 40 lords who were looking at the floor." He reached into his riding coat and produced incongruously a small flask, which he held out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Drink it," he said. "You're doing that thing where you refuse help on principle because accepting help feels like acknowledging vulnerability, and you've been refusing to acknowledge vulnerability for approximately 8 months. You're going to lose fingers if you don't get warm." She stared at him. He waited. She took the flask. She drank. The liquid hit her system like a small controlled explosion, heat spreading from her sternum outward, and she breathed out hard and her breath came out in a plume, and for approximately 3 seconds, the cold retreated. "How long have you been following me?" she said. Not a question exactly, more the act of recalibrating. "Since before the gates closed," he said. She looked at him. "There were reports from inside the palace," he said, "about a Luna who had been watching border intelligence for months while the court looked elsewhere. Who presented a council with the location of a cipher error in a forged document 3 hours before her exile." He tilted his head slightly. That kind of attention to detail is not common. "I had time," she said. "They took everything else." "They took the things they could see," he said. "They left the parts that actually matter." She was quiet. The ruins of Greyhorn Pass were very still around them. Old catastrophe, frozen and smoothed, and in the middle of it, 2 people having a conversation that felt, to Seraphine, less like the beginning of something and more like a recognition. The particular experience of encountering information that confirmed what some part of you had always known was true, waiting to be proven. "What do you want from me?" she said. Direct. She did not have the energy or the inclination for oblique approaches. Kaelor Thorne looked at her with those very still eyes. "I want to show you what power actually looks like," he said. "Not what Draven made of it. What it actually is. And in exchange, your intelligence, your analysis of the border situation, your knowledge of this empire's internal architecture." A pause. "And your willingness to stop thinking like a queen who lost her position and start thinking like someone who is going to build something considerably larger." Seraphine looked at him for a long time. She thought about the 40 lords looking at the floor. She thought about the forged signature and the understaffed garrisons and the boy of 19 who had looked at her from beneath the execution hood. She thought about Draven's jaw working at the council table, knowing what he knew and choosing, anyway. She thought about the things she had recognized, standing beneath the throne dais with mud on her silver gown, the first crack, the thing that lived inside every empire that ruled through fear rather than earned loyalty. She handed the flask back. "Show me," she said. They rode north as the dawn came fully up over the ruins, the black-clad riders forming a loose perimeter around them, and Seraphine rode without looking back at the direction of the palace, not because it didn't matter, but because what mattered was ahead. And she had learned. In 8 months of watching and waiting and surviving and constructing, in the long, cold education of being treated as furniture in a court she had once helped run, she had learned that there was a precise moment when the past became a resource rather than a wound. She was in that moment. She rode straight. Behind them, neither of them yet knowing, a rider had left House Valor's outer gates at full gallop heading south. Not north, south, carrying a message in fresh ink addressed to 3 different recipients. The first recipient was Lord Biron Casimir. The second was the war chief Drevnak of Clan Ashvar. The third was a name that Seraphine had seen once, in a document she was not supposed to have access to, in the old records annex, 3 months before her exile, in handwriting she had recognized with a cold shock that she had carefully, immediately, sealed behind the interior wall where she kept the information she was not ready to use. The third name was Ivalice's. But the message was not from Ivalice. The message was from High Steward Vorin. And what it set in motion in those 3 different directions simultaneously, like a blade dropped into still water, would not reach Seraphine until she was deep inside the Black Mountains of Varinth, standing in an arena before thousands of warriors, with the Supreme Alpha's cloak being placed across her shoulders, when she would understand for the first time the full architecture of what had been built around her. Not exile. Something far older than exile. Something that had been waiting in the ruins of Greyhorn Pass since before she was born. The rider had a 6-hour head start. Seraphine did not know this yet. She knew the cold at her back and the horse under her, and the flask warmth still sitting in her chest like a small coal, and she knew Kaelor Thorne riding at her left with the particular stillness of a man who had decided something and was not second-guessing it. And she knew the black mountains ahead were getting larger and more specific against the pale sky. She knew one other thing. "Vorin wrote to someone," she said. Kaelor did not look at her. He watched the terrain ahead with the automatic scanning attention of someone who had spent years in country where not watching the terrain ahead had consequences. "What makes you say that?" The way he looked at the floor in the council chamber, she said. Not guilt. Something more complicated. A man who feels guilty looks at the floor because he can't hold your eyes. Vorin looked at the floor because he was calculating. A pause. Calculating what? Kaelor said. How long he had before whatever he'd already set in motion became visible. She felt more than saw the shift in Kaelor's attention. A slight reorientation, like a compass needle responding to a changed field. He was looking at her now, not the terrain, and she kept her eyes forward because she understood instinctively that turning to receive that look would be the wrong move. That part of what was being established between them in these early hours had to do with whether she would perform for his attention or simply be what she was and let the attention land where it landed. How long have you known about Vorin? He said. Known is a strong word. Suspected. 3 months. The cipher error I reported to him. I reported it twice. The second time in writing specifically because I wanted a record. He acknowledged it both times and did nothing with it. A man of Vorin's competence doesn't fail to act on relevant intelligence unless acting on it conflicts with something he values more than competence. Or someone he answers to. Yes. The Black Riders moved around them, steady and quiet. One of them, a woman, Seraphine had noticed, riding with the particular economy of someone trained from early, with a scar that ran from her left jaw down beneath her collar, peeled slightly outward to check a ridge to the northeast, and then returned without signal or comment. And Kaelor did not acknowledge the movement because it did not require acknowledgement, because it was the movement of someone doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Seraphine watched that small exchange of non-communication and felt something loosen slightly in the region of her sternum. This was what a functioning unit looked like. She had forgotten. The name on the message, Kaelor said. The third recipient. You said you saw it once. She looked at him now. He was already looking at her. Neither of them looked away. You have someone inside the palace, she said. Had, he said. Past tense as of this morning. Is he alive? She, and yes. A beat. For now. Seraphine thought about that. She thought about the architecture of it. Someone inside Valor's walls for long enough to know about the message, to get word out, to be burned in the process. That was months of investment at minimum, possibly years, which meant Kaelor Thorne had been watching House Valor for considerably longer than her exile. Why, she said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which she appreciated. Men who answered questions like that too quickly were men who had prepared answers rather than real ones. Because Draven was going to crack, he said finally. Not if. When. And the empire that comes apart in that particular valley affects 7 border territories, including 2 of mine. I needed to understand the internal mechanics before the external damage became my problem to manage. Clinical, she said. Accurate, he said. You could have made contact 6 months ago. You weren't ready 6 months ago. Her jaw tightened. The tightening was involuntary, and she was aware of it, and she left it visible because denying it would have been the kind of performance she had decided to stop giving. You don't know what I was 6 months ago. You were still hoping he'd come back, Kaelor said. Not cruelly, with the flat accuracy of someone reading terrain. Not to you, to himself. You were still watching the door. The coal in her chest did something complicated. She turned her eyes forward. And now, she said, now you stopped watching the door. He paused. Now you're interesting. Varanth announced itself with smell before sight, fire and metal, and something older beneath both, the particular olfactory signature of stone that had absorbed centuries of human effort and was saturated with it, that could not be scrubbed out because it was no longer surface, but structure. Then the gates. They were not designed to impress. That was the first thing she registered, and it revised something she had been preparing for. The palace entry performance, the calculated grandeur deployed to remind arriving guests of their relative smallness. Valor's gates were designed to impress. Every gate she had ridden through in her adult life had been designed to impress. These gates were designed to hold, which was an entirely different design priority, and produced a structure that was, in its way, more intimidating than any amount of decorative stonework, because it communicated a single, unambiguous message. Nothing gets through here that we don't decide gets through here. A soldier at the outer post, young, compact, with the alert eyes of someone who slept light, looked at Kaelor without the flinch that most people produced when Kaelor Thorne appeared in their visual field. Just looked. Received. Processed. "Lord," the soldier said. "We have a guest," Kaelor said. "Full access. My authority." The soldier's eyes moved to Seraphine. She let them move. She sat her horse with her sharpened face and her frost-stiffened wool dress, and she met the soldier's assessment with the same quality of attention she had been deploying for months, patient, direct, recording everything. The soldier nodded once. They rode through. Inside, Varanth was organized the way functional things were organized, around its purpose rather than its appearance. The training yards were close to the main structures rather than concealed behind them. The forge was central and loud. The housing arranged for movement and access rather than hierarchy and display. Seraphine saw, in the first 30 seconds, better logistical thinking than had been applied to any square foot of Vaelor's palace grounds in 6 years. She also saw people looking at her. Not with the court's curated assessment, that particular performance of evaluating someone while pretending to evaluate something else. Direct looking, open curiosity, and in some faces something harder, skepticism. The specific skepticism of people who had built something real and were watching a stranger ride in under the boss's authority and were not yet sold. She recognized the skepticism. She found she respected it. A woman crossed the yard toward them as they dismounted. 40, perhaps, with iron-gray hair cut short, and the kind of physical presence that announced she occupied space by choice rather than accident. She looked at Kaelor with the familiarity of long service, and at Seraphine with something that was not unfriendly, but was also not warm, which Seraphine thought was probably the honest position. "Merrin," Kaelor said. "She's smaller than I expected," Merrin said. "She's standing right here," Seraphine said. Merrin's eyes moved to her, a beat. Then, "So she is." Something shifted in the assessment, very slightly. "You need dry clothes and something hot. After that, Kaelor can do whatever political theater he's planned." "It's not theater," Kaelor said. "It's always theater," Merrin said, already moving. "Come on." Seraphine looked at Kaelor. "She runs the Citadel's operations," he said. "Has for 11 years. If she decides she doesn't like you, I'll hear about it 3 times a day for the foreseeable future. And if she decides she does, then you'll have the most useful ally inside these walls." He met her eyes. "Her judgment is better than mine on people. I make better decisions about territory." Seraphine thought about what it meant that he said that plainly, without the modified self-deprecation men usually deployed when acknowledging a woman's superiority in any specific area. The reflexive softening that communicated the acknowledgement wasn't quite real. He said it the way he said everything, like a man reporting conditions rather than performing attitudes. She followed Merrin. But the room they gave her was small and warm and had a window that faced the training yards rather than the mountain wall, which meant someone had thought about it. Merrin set down a bundle of clothes, plain, functional, sized approximately correctly, and turned to leave and then stopped. "How'd you manage the cipher argument?" Merrin said, not looking at her. Addressed to the middle distance, the way people asked questions they actually wanted answered but didn't want to appear to want answered. "I paid attention when I was supposed to be furniture." Merrin turned then, looked at her properly. Something in the iron-gray face moved. Not sentiment exactly, something older and more durable than sentiment. 40 lords, Merrin said. 40 lords. And not one. Not one. Merrin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Kaelor's going to put you in front of the full garrison before nightfall. Big gesture. Political statement." A pause. "They're going to test you, not publicly, individually. In the corridors, at meals, in the training yards. The ones who matter most aren't going to do it, obviously." "I know how tests work," Seraphine said. "You know how court tests work," Merrin said. "These are different. These people gave years of their lives to this place. They don't owe loyalty to rank. They give it to people who've earned it." She looked at Seraphine steadily. "So the question is, what do you actually know how to do?" It was the right question. Seraphine had been asked many questions in the past 8 months, and almost none of them were the right question. This one landed with the particular weight of something that deserved a real answer. "I know how empires fail from the inside," she said. I spent 6 years watching the mechanics of one while it happened in real time. She paused. I know the eastern border situation in specific detail. I know which lords in 5 outer provinces are looking for an alternative to Draven's authority. I know how to read a room full of people who are lying and identify the 3 who are lying about something that matters. Another pause. And I know how to survive losing everything and arrive somewhere new and not perform weakness I don't feel. Marin looked at her for a long time. Dry off, she said finally. Eat. The garrison meets at dusk. She left. Seraphine stood alone in the small, warm room with the window facing the training yards, and she watched the activity below. The disciplined violence of sparring, the organized flow of people doing specific things for specific reasons, and she breathed. In, out. She thought, this is what it feels like to be in a place that is trying to function rather than a place that is trying to appear to function. She thought, be careful. The feeling of relief after extended threat is its own kind of danger. Relief loosens things that need to stay tight. She ate. She dressed. She watched the yards until the light changed. Kaelor found her at the window when he came to bring her down to the arena. He stood in the doorway in the way he stood in all spaces, without announcement, without the slight theatrical pause men sometimes use to allow their presence to register. Just present. Ready, he said. Tell me what you expect from this, she said, not moving from the window yet. He came into the room, stopped a few feet from her and looked out the window at the same view she'd been looking at. 2 people looking at the same thing, which was different from 2 people looking at each other, and she found she trusted this mode of conversation more than most. I expect the garrison to look at you and see a court woman with mud on her history, he said. I expect you to change that impression within approximately 10 minutes, or I've made a miscalculation. And if you've made a miscalculation, then I've made a miscalculation. He said it with the equanimity of someone who had been wrong before and incorporated it without drama. I don't think I have. Why? He looked at her then, directly, with those still eyes that had the quality of patience that comes not from temperament, but from having learned, the hard way, that reactivity costs more than it gains. Because you've been the most dangerous person in every room you've been in for 8 months, he said, and no one noticed because you let them look at the dress and the title and the wine goblet, and they stopped there. A pause. I don't stop there. Something moved in her chest. Not the soft thing. Not the thing she had spent 8 months converting into fuel. Something older and harder. Something that recognized being seen by something that had actual vision rather than the performance of it. She turned from the window. Then let's not keep them waiting, she said. The great arena of Varanth held 3,000 warriors and was full. She understood as she walked out into it what Marin had meant by theater. Understood and revised her assessment simultaneously. Because theater and reality were not mutually exclusive, and sometimes the theater was the container the reality needed to travel in. The firelight. The gathered faces, hundreds of them, ranging from the very young to the scarred and long experienced. The sound of it, which was not silence and was not noise, but something in between, the specific hum of a large group of people actively withholding judgment. She walked beside Kaelor and she did not look at the crowd. She looked straight ahead. She breathed evenly. She kept her hands still at her sides. He stopped them at the center. House Valor exiled this woman without trial on fabricated charges, Kaelor said. His voice crossed the arena without effort or apparent volume. A voice that had practiced filling large spaces with truth rather than performance. She spent 8 months watching an empire eat itself while the people responsible looked away. She survived the Black Fang frontier in a wool dress and a decision. A pause. Her name is Seraphine. She's a guest of Varanth. You'll treat her accordingly. He took off his riding cloak. He placed it across her shoulders. The arena did not explode into sound. It went the other way. Deeper into that suspended hum, 3,000 people recalibrating simultaneously, and then, from the left side, a single voice. The soldier from the outer gate, she thought, though she couldn't locate him. One sound. Then another. Then a section of the garrison, and then most of it, in the particular rolling cadence of people who were not performing approval, but expressing something that had no other available outlet. Seraphine stood under the weight of the cloak, and the weight of the sound, and she did not smile. This was not the moment for smiling. This was the moment for being what you were and letting it be enough. And she was, still, straight-spined, clear-eyed, with the cloak's warmth across her shoulders and the cold still living in her bones from the frontier night, and 8 months of compressed fury sitting in her chest like a weapon waiting for its correct application. She looked at the faces looking at her. She thought, remember these faces. They are worth remembering. She thought, this is not rescue. Understand that from the first moment. This is territory. New territory, different rules, different dangers, same fundamental requirement. Pay attention, stay useful, don't perform what you don't feel. She thought, Vorin sent a message to 3 people. She thought, the third name. She thought, I need to know what was in that message before it reaches its destination. She turned to Kaelor under the roar of the arena, and she said quietly, meant only for him, your intelligence asset inside the palace, the one who got burned. I need to talk to her. He looked at her with those still eyes. She's here, he said. Seraphine went very still. She arrived 2 hours before you did, he said. She's been inside your palace for 4 years. A pause, and in the pause something shifted in his expression. Not quite unease, but the specific quality of a man delivering information he is not certain will land cleanly. Her name is Mira, the thin, angular girl, 22. Cruel with borrowed cruelty, carrying it with more enthusiasm than skill. The one who had come to summon her to serve Evelise, and whose right hand had made that small, unconscious fist against her skirt. The one Seraphine had read as a loyalist, as Evelise's creature. She had been wrong. In 8 months she had not been wrong about anyone. The arena was still making its noise around them, and the cloak was warm across her shoulders, and she stood in the center of all of it, and recalibrated with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned that the price of pride in your own assessment was paid in someone else's life. What else don't I know? She said. Kaelor held her gaze. Everything in that message, he said quietly. Vorin wasn't writing to warn 3 people about you. He paused. He was writing to warn 3 people about what's already in motion, something that started before you were ever exiled. His jaw set slightly. Something that needed you out of that palace to proceed. The arena noise, the warmth of the cloak, the cold in her bones. Needed me out, she said. You were the only one who would have seen it, he said. You were the only one paying attention. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then we need to move faster than whatever timeline they're operating on, she said. Yes, he said. Show me the intelligence. All of it. Tonight. He looked at her for one more moment with that still, patient, assessing gaze, and then he nodded. Not the nod of a man granting permission, the nod of a man recognizing a partner. They walked out of the arena together as the sound followed them into the dark mountain air, and Seraphine moved with the certainty of someone who had finally stopped surviving and started building. But underneath the certainty, in the organized interior space where she kept the things she was not ready to use, one sentence repeated itself with the cold insistence of something that would not be filed away or deferred. Vorin had served 4 kings, and every single one of them had fallen. The intelligence room was cut directly into the mountain. No windows. Stone walls that sweated cold even in the warmth of the oil lamps, and the smell of old paper and iron, and the particular dry precision of a space where people came to think rather than to be seen thinking. Maps covered every surface, not the decorative cartography she had known in Vaelor's war room, the kind commissioned for aesthetic as much as function, with illustrated borders and illuminated titles. These were working documents, annotated in multiple hands, covered in numbers and corrections, and the layered evidence of ongoing revision. Maps that had been wrong, and been fixed, and been wrong again, and been fixed again. She stood in the center of it and felt something she recognized as hunger. Kaelor moved to the eastern wall and put his hand flat on a map of the Black Fang territories and the provinces beyond, and she came to stand beside him without being invited because waiting to be invited was no longer a mode she had available. Start with Vorin, she said. He looked at her sideways. You start with the border situation. The border situation is the symptom. Vorin is the disease. You don't treat symptoms before you understand what's generating them. A pause. Then he stepped back from the map and gestured, which she understood as, it's yours. She looked at the intelligence laid out across the table beneath the eastern wall. Mira's reports. She could identify them by the handwriting, now that she knew, and the identification produced a cold, retroactive alertness, the sensation of recalibrating every interaction she had catalogued with the wrong label. Small papers, tight script. 4 years of Mira Colfin moving through Vaelor's court as Evelisa's instrument, which was a fiction so complete and so sustained that Seraphine felt the specific professional respect of someone who understood what that kind of performance cost. She read for 40 minutes without speaking. Kaelor sat in the corner and did not interrupt her, which she noted and appreciated. The discipline of a man who understood that interrupting someone reading intelligence was the same as interrupting a surgeon mid-incision. The picture assembled itself with the cold mechanical clarity of something she had been sensing in fragments for months, now arriving whole. Vorin had not been serving Draven. Vorin had not been serving Evelisa. Vorin had been serving a structure that predated both of them by approximately 23 years, a compact between 3 houses, Casimir, Ashvar, and a third name she had to read twice before it settled, built around the singular strategic objective of destabilizing the Vaelor bloodline at the precise moment of maximum internal vulnerability, collapsing it inward rather than conquering it directly, and redistributing the territorial assets in the chaos. Not a coup. An implosion. Designed to look like organic failure, she had been correct about the crack. She had been wrong about who made it. She looked up. Kaelor. He was already looking at her with the attention of someone who had been watching her read and tracking the progress of her comprehension. "How long have you known the full structure of this?" she said. 6 months. "And you didn't move." "Not my empire to save." She looked at him. Something in her chest that was not quite anger but occupied adjacent territory. "People are going to die in those border territories. They already are." "Yes," he said, without apology and without performance. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough to know that some costs could not be prevented from the outside, only witnessed and then addressed. "That's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "Which is why you're here." She turned back to the papers. She needed 30 more seconds inside her own head to finish the restructuring, to take the version of events she had assembled over 8 months, the version she had been navigating by, and break it down and rebuild it around the new foundation. It was the mental equivalent of a controlled demolition. You had to be precise about what you kept and what you let fall, because keeping the wrong things would compromise everything built on top of them. What she kept. Draven was genuinely compromised by Evelise. That was real, not manufactured. What she revised? Evelise had not acted alone or spontaneously. She had been positioned, groomed and positioned over years by people who understood exactly which weaknesses Draven carried and which lever would move him fastest. What she discarded entirely. The idea that her exile had been Draven's decision. It had been Vorin's decision, executed through Draven's name. She had been removed not because she was inconvenient to Draven, but because she was dangerous to the structure. The thought sat in her chest with the specific weight of something that clarified everything and solved nothing. "Mira," she said, "I need to talk to her tonight. She's in the East Quarter. She knows you're here." "Does she know I know who she is?" "I told her an hour ago." Seraphine nodded once. She picked up her coat from the chair where she had laid it and walked to the door and then stopped. "The third name," she said, without turning. "In the compact. House Fenwick." Silence behind her. "The boy they hanged," she said. "Fenwick's third son. He was 19 years old, and he spoke about the king's military failures in the eastern passes." She paused. He wasn't speaking carelessly. He was delivering a message they needed public. They sacrificed him to create the narrative. She heard Kaelor stand. "Seraphine." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the still patient assessment, not the terrain-reading neutrality. Something that had broken through the surface of all that disciplined control. Something that looked, very briefly, like the particular pain of a person watching someone else understand something he had hoped they would not have to understand. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what the timeline indicates." She looked at him for a moment. She thought, there are people in this world who will spend a 19-year-old boy to move a narrative 3 inches in a direction they need it to go. She had known this in the abstract. She was knowing it now in the specific, and the specific was a different order of knowledge. It lived in the body rather than the mind, settled into muscle and bone rather than staying clean and theoretical in the upper registers of thought. She thought, then be the thing they cannot spend. Be the thing that costs more to remove than to leave standing. She turned back to the door. I'll find Mira, she said. Mira was sitting on the floor of the East Quarter room when Seraphine arrived. Not on the bed, not at the table. On the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, which was the position of someone who had been inside their own head for several hours and had not found their way out yet. She looked up when Seraphine came in, and her face did the thing that faces do when they are too exhausted to manage expression anymore. It simply showed what was there, which was a 22-year-old who had been performing a fiction for 4 years and had finally stopped and did not yet know who she was without the performance. Seraphine sat on the floor, not in the chair, not standing over her. On the floor, same level, which communicated the thing she needed to communicate, which was, this is not an interrogation. This is two people who have both been inside something terrible and need to understand its architecture together. Mira watched her sit, and something in the young woman's face moved, surprise, or the collapse of a prepared defensive position that was no longer needed. They were quiet for a moment. The fist, Seraphine said. Mira looked at her. Your right hand against your skirt when you came to fetch me for Evelise. I read it as satisfaction. A pause. It wasn't. Mira's jaw tightened. It was, she said. It was both things. I'm not going to lie to you about what that was. Seraphine looked at her steadily. Both things at once. I spent 4 years learning to enjoy what Evelise enjoyed because that was the role, and some of it stopped being performance. That's the honest answer. Mira's voice had the flat, exhausted quality of someone past the point of shaping their words for effect. I'm not asking you to find that acceptable. I'm not interested in what you're asking me to find acceptable, Seraphine said. I'm interested in what you know. A beat. Then Mira unfolded herself slightly, the shift of someone setting down a weight. Vorin met with Baron Casimir 9 months ago, she said, before Evelise had fully consolidated, before your formal stripping. I was in the passage behind the council annex because Evelise had me following Draven's movements for her own reasons. A pause. Vorin told Baron the timeline had accelerated, that the Luna was more observant than they had accounted for, and the window for clean removal was narrowing. Seraphine breathed steadily. In, out. Clean removal, she said. Exile was the clean version, Mira said. There was another version. The room was very still. Go on, Seraphine said. Evelise argued against the other version, not from conscience. Mira's mouth pressed flat. Because a dead Luna creates a martyr. An exiled one just creates a cautionary tale. A beat. Vorin agreed. The exile was compromise. Seraphine sat with this. She sat with the information that her life had been a line item in a negotiation, that she was alive because her death had been deemed strategically inefficient, and she did the conversion, grief into fuel, raw cold fear into usable structure, with the efficiency of long practice. The message Vorin sent, she said, when they exiled me. You intercepted it. I copied it before it went out. I had 3 hours. Mira reached into her boot and produced a folded paper, thin from being folded many times, and held it out. Seraphine unfolded it. She read it twice. The message was not what she had expected, which told her something important about the limits of her own model of the situation, and she made a note of that limitation because it was the kind of note that saved lives. The message to Baron Casimir confirmed the exile and authorized the next phase. The message to Drevnak of Clan Ashvar confirmed the trade corridor arrangement and requested the false flag action in the Thornfeld Valley within 60 days of the Luna's removal. The message to the third name, House Fenwick, the father of the hanged boy, was different from both. It was a single line. It said, "She is out. Move the asset." "What asset?" Seraphine said. Mira looked at her. And in the quality of that look, the specific reluctance of someone who has been carrying information they hoped they would never have to deliver. Seraphine felt the first real cold she had experienced since the frontier, and it had nothing to do with temperature. "The asset has been inside Varanth for 2 years," Mira said quietly. The room reconfigured. Every surface of it, every arrangement of lamp and stone and shadow, reorganized itself around the new information with the vertiginous speed of a physical space shifting beneath your feet. "Inside Varenth," Seraphine said. "Yes." "Who?" Mira's jaw worked. "I don't know the name. I know the function. I know what they were positioned to do when the signal came." "Which is?" "Compromise Kaelor's standing with the allied alpha houses." Mira's voice was flat and precise, delivering a report she had rehearsed. "There are 7 houses currently under Varenth's alliance compact. If Kaelor's integrity is publicly questioned, specifically regarding political manipulation, specifically regarding his use of another ruler's discarded Luna as a strategic instrument, 4 of those houses withdraw on principle, leaving him with 3. A pause. 3 is not enough to hold the northern territories against Ashvar's new alliance. Seraphine stood. Not from agitation, from the physical requirement of thinking at this speed. Her body needed to be vertical, needed the alignment of spine and breath and the particular quality of attention that standing allowed her. "They needed me here," she said. Not a question. Assembling it aloud because assembling it aloud sometimes revealed the pieces that silent assembly missed. "My arrival here is the trigger. Kaelor, placing his cloak on my shoulders in front of 3,000 witnesses, is the material they use to make the case to the allied houses that he's maneuvering politically with a foreign asset." "Yes," Mira said. Vorin designed the exile knowing Kaelor had been watching Vaelor, knowing his history with the border territories, knowing that the combination of my intelligence value and my circumstances would make me exactly the kind of resource Kaelor would not leave on the frontier. She stopped. He built a trap that required Kaelor to make the right choice in order to spring it. The silence was very full. "How long?" Seraphine said. "Until the asset moves." The message was sent at midnight. The asset will receive it within 2 days. Mira looked at her. "You have 2 days before everything Kaelor built here becomes a liability he has to defend instead of a base he can operate from." Seraphine stood in the middle of the intelligence room's cold stone walls and breathed with the conscious attention of someone managing the precise border between usable adrenaline and the kind that made you stupid. She thought, Vorin has been doing this for 23 years. He has outlived 4 kings. He has been the stable element inside every transition, the man looking at the floor while he calculated, the man who understood that the person who survived every reign was the person no one ever looked at directly. She thought, he built this comprehensively. He planned for Kaelor's integrity. He planned for my intelligence. He planned for the time it would take me to arrive and the gesture Kaelor would make and the narrative it would generate. She thought, he did not plan for Mira, because Mira was Evelise's creature, and Evelise was part of the structure, and the structure did not surveil itself. She thought, that is the crack. Right there, the one place where the architecture has a gap. She crossed the room and opened the door. "Come with me," she said to Mira. Mira stood. "Where?" "To tell Kaelor that the thing he just did in that arena was exactly what they needed him to do." Seraphine looked at her steadily. "And then we're going to figure out how to turn their trap into ours." "Oh." Kaelor took the information the way he took all information, standing still, listening completely, not performing any response until the delivery was finished. She gave it to him in full, without editing for impact, the way you delivered intelligence when the person receiving it was capable of handling the weight of it without the packaging. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The asset." "We have 2 days to find them before they move," Seraphine said. 2 days to search 300 people. Not 300. She moved to the operational map on the eastern wall. The asset needs access, not just physical access. They need the kind of proximity to allied house communications that allows them to construct a convincing narrative. That narrows it considerably. She looked at him. "Who has access to your correspondence with the allied houses?" 7 people, he said immediately. No hesitation, which told her the number was already in his head, had been since she started talking. "Then we start with 7. His jaw set. Not anger, she read. She was getting faster at reading him, but the specific physical manifestation of a man confronting the fact that the threat was intimate. Betrayal at distance was a military problem. Betrayal at proximity was something that lived in the body differently. that required you to look at faces you had known for years and apply a different lens. She understood this from the inside out. "I know what this feels like," she said. He looked at her. "Finding out that the architecture was wrong," she said, "that the structure you were navigating was not the actual structure." A pause. "You do the accounting and you find that some of what you trusted was real and some of it was placed there for you to trust, and the task is figuring out which is which without letting the process destroy everything in the process." He was very still. "Yes," he said quietly. "Then you know that the only way through it is fast and clean," she said. "You don't have the luxury of doubt once you've identified the target. Doubt is how the structure protects itself. It makes the cost of action feel higher than the cost of inaction." She looked at him steadily. "It isn't." His eyes held hers for a moment. Then he turned to the door and opened it and said a name to the soldier outside, and within minutes Marin was in the room with the iron-gray compact alertness of a woman who had been woken from shallow sleep and had arrived at full operational capacity before the door finished closing. Kaelor looked at Marin. Marin looked back at him with the long familiarity of 11 years and read his face, and her own face did something that Seraphine watched carefully. A flicker of something, a micro-movement at the corner of her left eye, quickly suppressed. Not guilt, not fear. Something that looked to Seraphine's calibrated attention, like the specific expression of a person in the presence of information they already have. The room temperature changed, not literally. In the register of bodies in proximity, understanding something simultaneously, a shift in the quality of the air between three people where one of them had just been seen. Kaelor went very still. He said quietly, with the controlled evenness of a man holding something violent at absolute minimum distance from the surface. "Marin." She met his eyes. 1 second, 2. "How long?" he said. Her jaw worked once. "Kaelor, how long?" The name she'd been carrying for 2 years was written in the 2 seconds of silence before she answered, in the way she looked at the floor. Not the way Vorin looked at the floor, calculating, but the way people looked at the floor when they had run out of calculations and arrived at the raw fact of what they had done. 14 months, she said. The word that came out of Kaelor Thorne in the silence after that was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the sound of something fundamental fracturing in a register below sound, the specific quiet of a man who has been betrayed by something he built his architecture around. And Seraphine stood in the middle of it and did not look away from either of them, because looking away was not available to her, because she was the reason Marin had received the signal, and she needed to see the full shape of this so she could build something on top of it. Marin was the woman who had run Varanth's operations for 11 years. Marin had access to all 7 allied house correspondences. Marin had been the first person to assess her when she arrived, asking exactly the right question. What do you actually know how to do? And Seraphine had answered fully, completely, had given the most honest accounting of her own assets she had delivered to anyone in 8 months, and every word of it had landed in ears connected to the structure she had come here to fight. She thought, they are very good. She thought, you have to be better. Kaelor had not moved. He was standing in the center of the room, with his hands at his sides and his face doing the work of containing something that, left uncontained, would have changed the structural integrity of the walls around it. And Seraphine looked at him and made a decision. She stepped between him and Marin, not to protect Marin, not from sentiment, from the cold strategic reality that Marin alive and talking was worth more in the next 48 hours than any other alternative, and that Kaelor's instincts in this moment were not wrong, but they were not useful, and she was the person in this room best positioned to make that case because she had made it once already, standing in the ruins of Greyhorn Pass in a wool dress, choosing calculation over collapse. She's the counter move, Seraphine said. Kaelor's eyes cut to her. They built this trap using her access, she said. We use her access to build the response. Her voice was level. Level the way the frontier cold was level. Not calm, not comfortable, but even and reliable and committed to its own temperature regardless of what was happening around it. They expect her to deliver the narrative to the allied houses. She delivers a different one that puts the full architecture of this compact in front of 7 houses simultaneously and lets them do the math on what Casimir and Ashvar were planning to do with the northern territories once Varanth fell. Marin was looking at her with an expression Seraphine did not have a previous category for. "You'd trust her," Kaelor said. The word trust carrying everything it was required to carry. "No," Seraphine said. "I'd give her something more reliable than trust. I'd give her the only move that doesn't end with her spending the rest of her life in a Black Mountain cell." She looked at Marin. The Compact sacrificed a 19-year-old boy to move a narrative. When they're finished with Varanth, they'll clean their instruments. You know that. Marin's face was very still. "They always clean their instruments," Seraphine said. The silence in the room had the quality of a decision approaching its moment of irreversibility. The specific weight of a junction where every path behind you closes, and the only thing ahead is the consequence of who you decide to be in the next 30 seconds. Marin looked at Kaelor. Kaelor looked at her with the face of a man standing at the edge of the thing he had built, looking at the crack that ran from the foundation to the surface, deciding whether to walk away from the structure or find out if it was still worth saving. He did not look away from Marin. "If you run this wrong," he said quietly, "there is no version of after. That includes you." Marin's chin lifted slightly, the small physical signature of someone accepting terms that were the only terms available. "I know," she said. Seraphine looked between them, at the specific devastation of two people who had built something together standing in the wreckage of the trust that made the building possible. And she felt something settle in her chest, cold and final and necessary. The completion of a process that had begun in the grand hall of House Kaelor, with mud drying on silver silk and a goblet held still by the deliberate effort of a hand that wanted to do something else entirely. She was not the woman she had been 8 months ago. She was not the woman she had been this morning. The woman she was becoming had no name yet in any language she had been taught, but she could feel its shape, harder than what came before, more precise, built from the specific material of surviving things that were designed to end you and choosing each time to convert the damage into something load-bearing. She turned to Kaelor. 2 days, she said. "Give me 2 days and the full access Marin has to Allied House communications, and I will build them a story so complete and so documented that when it arrives in those 7 houses, Casimir and Ashvar won't have a seat at any table in this empire." A pause. "And Vorin will understand, for the first time in 23 years, what it feels like to be the inconvenient one." Kaelor looked at her for a long moment. Outside the stone walls of Varanth, somewhere in the dark of the corridors, a door closed quietly. Neither of them heard it. Neither of them knew that the message, Marin's message, the one they had not yet written, the countermove that did not yet exist, had already been anticipated. That Vorin had built one more layer into his architecture, one more contingency, one more failsafe designed for the specific possibility that his asset was compromised, and the woman he had exiled into the cold turned out to be exactly as dangerous as he had originally assessed. The last layer was already in motion, and its target was not Kaelor. It was the 3 outer province lords who had written to Seraphine in the old cipher, the only people in the Empire who would come for her without being asked. The door that had closed quietly in the corridor outside belonged to a man named Sevek. Seraphine did not know this yet. She was still looking at Kaelor and he was still looking at her, and the word yes had not yet been spoken aloud. But it existed in the room the way decisions existed before language caught up to them, as weight, as heat, as the particular quality of air between two people who have arrived at the same conclusion from different directions and recognized each other in the arriving. Kaelor said, 2 days. Then a soldier hit the door running, not knocking. Running into the door, catching himself on the frame, a young man with blood on his collar that was not his own, and the specific wide-eyed focus of someone delivering information so urgent it had burned through every protocol between its source and this room. "Rider from Lord Aldrich's territory," he said. "Harken pass." They hit the garrison at dawn. Seraphine felt the sentence land in her body before her mind fully processed it. Harkon Pass. Lord Aldrich. One of the 3 outer province lords who had written to her in the old cipher. The man who had, 3 months ago, sent her 7 words that constituted the only evidence she had possessed for weeks that someone inside the Empire still saw clearly. The eastern routes are burning. I remember my oath. "How many?" Kaelor said. "The rider says the garrison's gone, all of it." The soldier's jaw worked. "Lord Aldrich got 1 man out." 1. A beat. The man says Aldrich told him to find you, told him to say the name Seraphine. The room was very quiet. Seraphine thought Vorin moved in less than 12 hours. She thought he had the contingency prepared and ready, and the exile was not just a removal. It was a starting pistol. She thought Aldrich used his last rider to say her name, which meant Aldrich was either dead or about to be. And a man who knew he was dying had chosen to spend his last breath on a direction rather than a farewell. She did not let herself sit with that. She converted it immediately, cold and efficient, because sitting with it was a luxury that would cost Aldrich's sacrifice its purpose. The other two, she said to Kaelor, Lords Fenris and Bryn Caster. Do you have any contact in their territories? Fenris I can reach in 6 hours by fast rider, Kaelor said. He was already moving to the tactical table. Already in the operational mode she had watched him access in the arena, that quality of absolute forward-oriented attention that left no bandwidth for anything that was not the immediate problem. Bryn Caster is 3 days out. If they move on him with the same speed, they won't, Seraphine said. Bryn Caster is positioned too close to the central trade routes. Visible. They'll want him neutralized quietly, which means they'll move through his internal council first. She came to the table beside Kaelor. He has time. Fenris doesn't. Kaelor looked at her. You know their territories, he said. I memorized everything they sent me, she said. Every cipher message, every implied reference to local geography. She looked at the map. Fenris wrote to me twice. Both times he referenced the Northern Mill Road as his primary communication route. If they want to isolate him, they cut the Mill Road first, which means they're moving from the northeast, which means they're already staged. Kaelor's hand was flat on the map, and she could see the tendons in it, the specific tension of someone processing the gap between what was needed and what was available. I have 40 riders I can move in an hour, he said. Not enough to break a staged assault. Enough to extract Fenris if he's not already. Send them, she said. It splits the garrison. Send them, she said again. Fenris alive is leverage. Fenris dead is a message to every outer province lord in the Empire that the compact kills anyone who considered alternatives. She looked at him directly. Send them and make sure the rider to Fenris carries the full documentation of the compact, not a summary, the full document, so that when Fenris reads it, he understands what he's been living inside, and he makes the choice with full information. Kaelor looked at her for 1 second. Then he turned to the soldier in the doorway and gave the orders in the clipped, precise language of a man who had run enough operations to understand that extra words in those moments were not additional clarity, but additional opportunity for error. The soldier left at speed. Merrin had not moved. She was standing against the eastern wall with the stillness of a person who had accepted the terms of their situation and was waiting for their role in the next sequence to be defined. Seraphine looked at her and made the calculation she had been making and remaking since the moment of recognition, the cost-benefit of trust that was not trust, of using an instrument that had been used against you, of the specific and uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most dangerous tool available was the one someone else had already sharpened. Write the message to the allied houses, Seraphine said to Merrin. Merrin looked at her. Tonight, Seraphine said, before the compact knows the Harkon garrison fell, before they know we know about the timeline. She held Merrin's gaze steadily. While they still think the trap is intact. What do you want it to say? Merrin said. The truth, Seraphine said. All of it, documented and sourced. The compact structure, the 23-year timeline, the Fenwick boy, the false flag in Thornfeld Valley, the asset placement inside Varenth, the territorial redistribution plan for after the collapse. A pause. And the names. Every name, including yours. Merrin's breath came out slow and controlled, including mine. A confession from the inside is worth 40 external accusations, Seraphine said. 7 allied house lords reading a document with your name on it as the source will not dismiss it. They cannot dismiss it, because you have no strategic reason to invent it. She looked at Merrin with the flat honesty the moment required. This is the only version of the next 48 hours where you come out on the other side of them. Merrin looked at the floor. Then she looked up and crossed to the writing table without another word, and sat down and picked up a pen, and Seraphine watched her and thought, everyone has a moment when they decide what they actually are. Most people have it forced on them, rather than chosen. Marin was choosing right now in real time, and the quality of that choice would determine whether the next 2 days ended in a structure or a ruin. Kaelor was at the door. He looked back at Seraphine. "I need to address the garrison," he said. "They'll have heard about Greyhorn Pass within the hour. If I don't speak to them before the rumor does the speaking—" "Go," she said. "Tell them the truth. Don't manage it. These people chose this place because it didn't manage them." She paused. "They'll hold." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. The look of a man who was not accustomed to someone knowing the right thing before he did and was recalibrating what he thought he knew about his own intelligence. He left. She sat down across from Marin and began reviewing the documentation in front of her, and the room contracted to the two of them, and the lamp, and the scratch of pen on paper. And outside the walls of Variant, the Black Mountains were massive and cold and indifferent. And somewhere in the dark between here and Fenris's territory, 40 riders were pushing horses at the edge of their endurance. And somewhere closer than any of them knew a man named Sevek was completing a task he had been given 14 months ago and had been waiting to execute with the patient discipline of someone who understood that timing was the difference between a wound and a killing blow. Sevek's task was simple. He had been a communications clerk for Variant's Allied correspondence for 2 years and a compact operative for 14 months, and he was neither a killer nor a strategist. He was a man who carried messages and understood that messages, at the right moment, in the right hands, were more lethal than any blade. His task was to take the single document Marin had prepared 3 weeks ago, before the signal came, before the trap was supposed to have sprung cleanly, the document that described Kaelor Thorne's acquisition of the discarded Luna of House Kaelor as a calculated political maneuver designed to destabilize the Alpha Alliance structure, and ensure that it arrived at Lord Kaewin of the Ironhold, the most cautious and the most influential of the 7 allied house lords, before dawn. He was 2 hours from the Ironhold outpost when Kaelor's riders found him, not by intelligence, by the specific accident of 40 riders moving fast through the same narrow pass at the same time, which was the kind of accident that looked in retrospect like design, but was simply the math of limited geography and simultaneous urgency. The rider leading Kaelor's column was a woman named Tess, 28, scar on her jaw, the same woman Seraphine had noticed in the first hour after her arrival. Tess pulled up when she saw the single horse moving south, and she assessed the speed and the direction and the hour, and she made the calculation in approximately 3 seconds that something about the specific combination of those 3 variables required stopping. Sevek ran. He did not get far, not because the riders were faster, which they were, but because running confirmed what stopping to question might not have established. And Tess was experienced enough to know the difference between a man who ran because he was afraid and a man who ran because he was carrying something. They brought him back to Variant an hour before dawn with the document still in his coat. Seraphine read it standing in the corridor outside the intelligence room with a lamp held close, still in the clothes she had arrived in, not having slept, running on the specific fuel of a body that has been an extended threat response long enough to have converted its own exhaustion into something dense and useful. She read the document once. Then she took it to Kaelor. He was in the garrison yard with the 40 riders who had turned back with Sevek, still in riding gear, his breath visible in the pre-dawn cold. When she came toward him, he read her face. He was getting faster at reading her face, she noticed, with the peripheral awareness of someone tracking multiple variables simultaneously. And he said nothing, simply took the document she held out. She watched him read it. His face did nothing that she could see, but his right hand, holding the paper, pressed flat against his thigh, the way her hand had pressed flat against the stone pillar in the grand hall of House Kaelor on the night Ivelisse arrived. And she recognized the gesture with the particular intimacy of seeing your own involuntary reflex in someone else's body. He looked up. "Kaewin," he said. "He's the right target," she said. "Most cautious, most respected, most resistant to anything that reads as political manipulation. If this lands on Kaewin without counter-documentation, the other 6 follow his read within 48 hours. Marin's letter. "Halfway written," she said. "But there's a faster move." He looked at her. "Kaewin comes here," she said. "Not a message, not documentation delivered by a courier he has no relationship with. You ride to Kaewin yourself tonight, before dawn reaches his territory." She paused. You put me in front of him, and you let me make the case. Kaelor was very still. You, he said. Me, she said. The woman this entire apparatus was built around removing, the one variable they needed out of the palace before they could move. She held his gaze. If I'm standing in front of Kaewin in person, alive and coherent, and in possession of the full documentation of the compact, the narrative inverts. It doesn't matter what the document in Sevek's coat says. It becomes evidence of the attempt, not evidence of the reality. He looked at her for a long time. She thought, he is calculating whether to trust me with something that belongs to him, something he has built over years that he cannot replace. She thought, this is the thing that separates the leaders who last from the ones who collapse. Not the willingness to be strong, but the willingness to hand the thing you cannot afford to lose to someone else and believe in their judgment. She thought, I know what it costs him to consider it. I know because I know what it cost me, standing in a grand hall with a goblet I was not allowed to put down, trusting that surviving with nothing was better than destroying everything on my way out. If Kaewin doesn't move, Kaelor said quietly, and the other 6 follow his read, Varenth doesn't fall, but it loses the alliance. And without the alliance, I cannot hold the northern territories against what Ashvar is staging. I know, she said. That's my life's work in your hands. I know, she said again, without softening it. He deserved the unpadded version. He breathed in through his nose, slow, deliberate, the breath of someone anchoring themselves in their own body before making a decision they cannot take back. Then we ride, he said. They rode hard, and the dark ate the miles, and Seraphine's body registered the punishment of it across her back and her legs, and the specific grinding ache of hands gripping reins through sustained cold. And she did not attend to any of it except to note that she was still functional, still upright, still ahead of the pain rather than behind it. Kaelor rode beside her and did not speak, and she did not speak, and between them the silence had the quality it had developed since the ruins of Greyhorn Pass. Not absence, but a kind of operational communication. The fluency of 2 people who had learned each other's processing speeds and respected them. She thought about Aldrich. She thought about his last rider delivering a direction instead of a farewell. And she thought about the particular kind of courage that produced that choice. Not the dramatic courage of the battlefield, not the courage that required an audience, but the small grinding courage of a man who was out of options and used his last one to point toward something larger than his own survival. She thought, that is the thing they never account for. The people who die pointing. She thought, don't waste it. The Ironhold emerged from the gray pre-dawn as a darker shape against dark sky, torchlit at its outer posts, solid in the way old structures were solid, not through beauty, but through the accumulated credibility of having held for a long time against things that wanted it to fail. A guard at the outer gate raised a hand and Kaelor's column pulled up. Lord Kaelor of Varenth, Kaelor said. I need 10 minutes with Kaewin. He'll want to give them to me. The guard looked at the column, looked at Seraphine. His face did the thing faces did when they encountered something they had been briefed to watch for and were not yet certain they were seeing. He went inside. He came back in 4 minutes, which was faster than it should have been, which meant Kaewin had already been awake, which meant Kaewin had already received something, a message, a warning, a piece of the architecture arriving ahead of them in a form they had not anticipated. The gate opened. Kaewin met them in the outer receiving yard rather than inside the hall, which was a deliberate choice about territory. Not the warmth of his own interior, not the social contract of hospitality, but the neutral cold of an open space where nobody had the advantage of familiarity. He was perhaps 60, with the build of a man who had been formidable once and remained, in the essential structural sense, formidable still. His eyes in the torchlight were the color of old iron, and they moved from Kaelor to Seraphine with the speed and precision of someone who had been reading rooms for decades. He looked at Seraphine for a long time. Luna of House Vaelor, he said. Not former. She noted that. Once, she said. The title is less relevant than what I know. I've already received 1 document about you tonight, Kaewin said, from a source I've trusted for 3 years. The source was run by a 23-year compact whose goal is the collapse of the Northern Alliance, Seraphine said. I have documentation. I have a confession from the internal asset who was placed inside Varenth to support the operation. And I have, she paused, Lord Aldrich's last rider. Harkon Pass fell at dawn yesterday. Aldrich used his final resource to send Kaelor a message that contained my name because a dying man with a choice about where to aim his last breath aimed it in this direction. Kaywin's jaw tightened. Aldrich, he said quietly. He remembered his oath, she said. His words, not mine. The receiving yard was very quiet. Kaywin looked at Kaelor. Is this your operation? No, Kaelor said. It's hers. I provided the horse. Something moved in Kaywin's face. A rapid assessment, a recalibration, the specific expression of a man who had prepared for one conversation and was now in a different one. Come inside, he said. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Seraphine spoke for most of them. She laid out the architecture of the compact with the same organized precision she had used to build it in her head over 8 months of observation in Vaelor's court, drawing on Mira's reports, the intercepted message, the cipher documentation, Sevek's capture, and the timeline of territorial moves that, assembled together, produced a picture that was not ambiguous and was not deniable and was not the work of a woman performing desperation. It was the work of a woman who had been given nothing but her own attention and had built with it anyway. Kaywin listened with the focused stillness of a man who had not survived 60 years by believing the first compelling thing he heard. He asked questions that were precise and uncomfortable, and she answered them without modification, because any modification would have been detectable to a man of his experience, and detection would have cost her everything. At the end of it, he sat back in his chair and looked at the document spread on the table between them and was quiet for a long time. Casimir's son signed the exile document, he said finally. Yes. And Fenwick's name is in the compact. Yes. His third son was used as a narrative instrument and then disposed of. Fenwick has been in the compact for 19 years. She paused. He knows what he is. He chose to know and continue anyway. Kaywin looked at the documents, at his hands, at some middle distance that contained, she thought, the specific view available only to a man reassessing the last several years of his alliances. I need until midday, he said, to write to the other 6, in my own hand, with my own seal. Midday, she said. He looked at her directly. You understand what you're asking me to do. This is not a military action. This is a political restructuring of the entire Northern Compact. It will have consequences for the next 20 years, she said. Minimum. I know. She held his gaze. So does the structure you're currently inside. They built it to last exactly that long. The only variable they didn't build into it was this room. Kaywin looked at her for a moment that contained the particular quality of a man making a decision he cannot take back. Midday, he said again. She nodded. She stood and in standing felt the full inventory of her body. The 2 days without real sleep, the frontier cold still living in her bones, the specific weight of sustained maximum capacity operation across the preceding hours. And she filed it, noted it, instructed it to wait. She turned to find Kaelor standing near the door he had not sat down for the entire 2 hours, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, the expression he had been suppressing since the ruins of Greyhorn Pass, the one that had moved beneath the surface of the still patient face in small controlled flickers, and now was not suppressed, was simply present, direct, and unguarded. The way faces were unguarded in the seconds after something finished that had required everything. He crossed to her. He did not reach for her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold room, close enough that looking straight ahead would have required looking at him. And she looked at him because looking away was not available and had not been for some time now, not from him. Kaywin will move, he said quietly. When Kaywin moves, the other 6 follow. Yes, she said. And when the 6 follow, the compact loses its structural support. He paused. Ashvar pulls back from Fenris's territory. Casimir is exposed. Vorin will run, she said. He survived 4 kings by knowing exactly when to step back from the fire. He'll step back. And Draven, he said. She looked at him. He's sitting in a palace that's about to lose 3/4 of its external support structure, Kaelor said. Evelise will have known before dawn. She'll have moved the portable assets. She was never staying past utility. Seraphine breathed in. She thought about the man who had told her she was the only person he had ever trusted completely. She thought about the jaw working at the council table. She thought about the covered walkway and the second night she had ever spent inside those walls. She thought, he is not the man he was, but he is also not the monster the situation required. He is something more complicated and less satisfying. A man who chose the comfortable failure over the difficult truth repeatedly until the choosing defined him. He's going to need someone to surrender to, she said. Someone whose terms don't require his annihilation. Someone with enough standing to make the surrender legible to the Empire as resolution rather than defeat. Kaelor looked at her. You, he said. Us, she said. The word landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved, and the torchlight in Kaywin's receiving room was the same in different gold that torchlight always was, burning the same in throne rooms and ruins and small cold spaces where two people arrived at the same word from different directions and recognized each other in the arriving. Outside the Ironhold, the dawn was coming up hard and fast, the way frontier dawns came, not gradually but all at once, the full weight of the day arriving without preparation. And somewhere between Varinth and the capital of House Vaelor, a rider in black was already moving, carrying in his saddlebag a letter sealed with an insignia that had not been used in the Empire for 40 years, addressed in a hand that wrote with the particular care of someone who understood that every word was a weapon and intended each one precisely. It was addressed to Queen Evelise. It was signed by Vorin, and its contents described, in full and documented detail, everything that Evelise had done to bring the Compact's plan to fruition, every name she had leveraged, every lord she had compromised, every move she had made that Vorin had guided, and every move she had made that she believed was her own. The letter was not a warning. It was a trade. And the price Vorin was asking for it was the only thing Evelise still had that Vorin needed. The location of Seraphine's child. The child that no one in this empire knew existed. The child that Seraphine herself believed was safe, hidden in a province so remote and so deliberately unremarkable that even the woman who had placed him there 3 months before her exile had allowed herself carefully, cautiously, in the deepest interior space where she kept the things she could not afford to lose, to believe the hiding had worked. The dawn was fully up now, and on a road 200 miles south, the rider carrying Vorin's letter was not slowing down. Kaelor's riders reached the remote province of Ashenmere in 31 hours. Seraphine knew, because she counted them. Counted the way she had counted everything across the preceding weeks. Not from anxiety, from the specific discipline of a woman who had learned that the only defense against being surprised was knowing, at every moment, exactly where you were in the sequence of events, and exactly how much time remained before the sequence moved without you. She had not slept. She had not pretended to try. She had spent the hours in Kaywin's map room, with the documentation spread before her and Kaelor at the opposite end of the table, each of them working in the particular parallel silence that had become their primary mode of operation, occasionally exchanging a word or a question or a corrected figure, and she had been aware of the hours passing with the specific and terrible clarity of someone waiting for news that would determine the entire architecture of what came next. When the rider came back, she heard the horse before the door opened. She was standing before he crossed the threshold. The rider was young, dusty, had the wide, careful eyes of someone carrying information they had been told to deliver intact and complete, and were doing their absolute best with. "The boy is safe," he said. The room did not change. The map stayed on the table and the lamp stayed burning, and Kaywin's steward, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stayed in his corner. And none of it changed because rooms did not respond to the specific relief that lived below language, below thought, in the part of the body where the things you could not afford to lose were kept. She sat down, not from weakness, from the physical requirement of processing something she had not allowed herself to fully feel for the 3 months since she had placed her son in a farmhouse in Ashenmere with a woman she trusted absolutely and ridden away from him in the dark without looking back, because looking back would have meant acknowledging that the distance between them was the thing keeping him alive, and she could not look at that and also function. She sat, and she breathed, and Kaelor, across the table, said nothing. He said nothing for long enough that she understood he had known this was coming, not the specific content of the revelation, but its magnitude. The evidence of something she had been protecting so far beneath the surface that its emergence changed the entire geometry of everything above it. "How long?" he said finally. 3 months before the exile, she said. I knew the exile was coming before they knew they were going to do it. I had 3 months of watching the architecture assemble, and I used 2 of them to make arrangements. A pause. The woman in Ashenmere is the daughter of my mother's household steward. She has no connection to Vaelor's court. No name that anyone looking for me would think to trace. She looked at the map in front of her without really seeing it. I chose Ashenmere because it is the most aggressively unremarkable province in the Empire. No strategic value. No noble house of standing. Nothing anyone with power has ever wanted. Vorin found it, Kaelor said. Vorin had 23 years and unlimited access to Imperial intelligence, she said, and 4 months of watching me move without understanding why I was moving. She paused. He's better than I gave him credit for. He's better than most people give him credit for, Kaelor said, which is precisely how he survived this long. She looked up at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through a problem that had emotional stakes. The particular quality of stillness that was not absence of feeling, but the disciplined containment of it, the way you held a flame steady by cupping your hands around it rather than gripping it. The letter to Evelise, she said. My riders intercepted it at the Crossfen Junction, he said. 4 hours ago. The letter is here. He placed it on the table between them. She looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. She sat with the specific experience of looking at a thing that had been designed to destroy her, that would have destroyed her if the geography had been slightly different, or the riders slightly slower, or the network of loyal people she had spent years building slightly less than it was. And she thought about what it meant that this was the instrument Vorin had chosen. Not her death. Her son. Because her death would have made her a martyr, as Evelise had calculated. But her son in the wrong hands made her something else entirely. Controllable. Returnable to the specific kind of helplessness that produced compliance. She had been an inconvenience. Her son would have been a leash. She thought, he understood me better than I understood him. He knew that everything I had converted to fuel, all the 8 months of compressed and organized fury, all the iron I had found in my own chest under sufficient pressure, all of it had a single point of vulnerability. A single place where the armor was not armor, but something entirely different. She thought, and he was going to use it. She thought, and he was stopped by a 22-year-old girl who made a different choice in a corridor. She thought about Mira. She reached across the table and picked up the letter and read it once and then folded it and set it down. I want to talk to Vorin, she said. Kaelor looked at her. Alive, she said. And before Kaywin's message reaches the allied houses, I want to talk to him before he knows how much of the structure has already come apart. Why? Kaelor said. She thought about this question. It deserved honesty rather than strategy. Because I spent 8 months watching a man I love choose comfortable failure over difficult truth, she said. And I need to know if Vorin made his choices the same way Draven did, out of weakness dressed as calculation, or if there's something underneath it I haven't understood yet, something that would change the picture. She paused. And because I am not going to build something new on top of a foundation I haven't fully excavated. Kaelor was quiet. You think understanding him changes what has to happen, he said. No, she said. I think understanding him changes what I build afterward. They brought Vorin to the Ironhold at noon. He had been found at the Casimir Estate's eastern annex, which was exactly where Seraphine had predicted he would be, and the prediction itself told her something about how well she had finally mapped him, the specific preference for proximity to an established power structure over independent movement, the behavior pattern of a man who had survived by being indispensable rather than by being strong. He was older than she had thought, 68 perhaps, the kind of age that showed not in weakness but in the specific density of someone who had been compressing experience for decades without releasing much of it. He sat across from her in Kaywin's receiving room without the document, without allies, without the administrative architecture that had given him his reach for 23 years, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man doing a final accounting. He was not afraid. She had expected fear and found instead something that looked surprisingly like relief. You have the letter, he said. I have the letter, she said. Then you know about the boy. I know about the boy. He looked at his hands on the table. He is genuinely safe. I want that on record with whoever is present. I found him. I did not move him. I used the knowledge of his location as a negotiating instrument with Evelise, not as a threat to the child himself. There are no witnesses in this room, she said, and records can be constructed later to say whatever is useful. Tell me something I can't verify. He looked at her. Draven was not always what he became, Thorne said. She held his gaze steadily and said nothing. When he was young, 22, 23, he was the most genuinely capable alpha I had served, Thorne said. Not performing it, actually capable. He read terrain correctly. He understood the difference between force and authority. He had the specific quality that very few rulers ever develop, the willingness to be wrong in private so he could be right in public. He paused. I built the compact before he failed. I built it because I had served 3 kings before him, and I understood that the empire's structure was too fragile to survive another unchecked collapse. The compact was designed to be a load-bearing mechanism beneath the succession, a guarantee you controlled, she said. Yes, he said without hesitation. A guarantee I controlled, because control was the only version of guarantee I trusted. She looked at him. She thought about what it did to a person, that specific belief, that the only safety was the kind you held yourself, that the only structure worth trusting was the one you built with no other hands. She thought about the particular loneliness of a man who had spent 23 years being the load-bearing wall no one was allowed to see, and she felt something that was not sympathy, but was adjacent to it. The specific recognition of someone who understood the logic even while standing inside its ruins. Where did it go wrong? She said. Evelise, he said. She was meant to be a correction, a recalibration. Draven had become static and the compact needed movement. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I underestimated how much she wanted the thing rather than the function. She didn't want to correct Draven. She wanted to replace everything he represented, including the institutional memory I had spent decades building. So she became your problem, Seraphine said. She became a variable I could not control, he said. And when you cannot control a variable inside a closed system, you remove it or you are removed by it. A pause. I chose a direction that I believed would accomplish both, removing her and removing you, the 2 elements that were destabilizing the system, in sequence. And the boy, she said. Her voice was even. She kept it even through the specific effort of a woman who had spent 8 months converting everything into fuel, and had in this moment to convert this too. Thorne looked at her with the full weight of his 68 years and his 23 years, and every king he had served, and every calculation he had made that had cost someone something they could not get back. The boy was insurance, he said. I'm not going to frame it as anything else. He was leverage. He was a last resort I was prepared to use. He paused. I'm telling you this because you asked for something you could not verify, and what I am telling you is true, and the truth is not good. She sat with it. She sat with the image of her son, 18 months old, in a farmhouse in the most aggressively unremarkable province in the empire, being cared for by a woman she trusted, sleeping the sleep of a child who did not know he was leverage. And she sat with what it meant that the man across from her had known where he was and had not moved him, had chosen, in the end, the letter over the action, the threat over the execution. She did not know if that distinction mattered. She thought it might. She thought it was the kind of thing she would need to know the answer to before she finished deciding what she was. I'm going to ask you one more thing, she said. Thorne waited. In 23 years, she said, was there ever a king you would not have undermined? A ruler who would have made the compact unnecessary? He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said quietly. She looked at him. You, he said. The receiving room was very still. You were the answer to the problem I had been solving the wrong way for 23 years, he said. A ruler who watched everything, who converted loss into intelligence, who understood the border situation before the border generals did, who stood in a council chamber with nothing and presented the architecture of her own persecution as calmly as a weather report. He paused. I knew from the 3rd month that removing you was the wrong move. I made it anyway because Evelise had already been set in motion and the compact's momentum required a completion. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought, this is the shape of it. This is what it looks like when the machinery is more important to its operator than the purpose it was built for. Not malice. Not stupidity. The specific failure of a man who spent so long building a system for surviving bad rulers that he forgot to ask what he would do with a good one. She thought, I cannot give him back the 23 years. I cannot give Aldrich back his garrison. I cannot give the Fenwick boy back his 19 years. She thought, but I can decide what the next 23 years look like. You're going to dismantle it, she said. The compact, yourself, in writing. Every member named, every action documented, every territorial arrangement detailed. Not because I'm forcing you to, because it is the only act that has any meaning left available to you. She held his gaze. And when it's done, you're going to live somewhere very small and very quiet, and you are never going to touch imperial governance again. Vorin looked at her. That's all, he said. That's all, she said. He looked at his hands again, at some interior calculation that she was not party to and did not need to be. Then he nodded once, a minimal movement, and she recognized it, because she had made it herself, in this same quality of moment, the nod of someone accepting the only terms that remained, not because the terms were merciful, but because they were precise. She stood. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame and stopped. Vorin. He looked up. The woman in Ashenmere, she said. Her name stays out of every document. Her connection to me stays out of every record. Her family's name stays clean. A pause. Yes, he said. Not negotiating, simply agreeing. She walked out. Draven surrendered at the first frost of the following month, not on a battlefield. There was no battle. The battle had already been decided in map rooms and letters, and the accumulated weight of 7 allied house lords removing their support from a structure that had been rotting from the inside for longer than anyone had wanted to acknowledge publicly. He came to the neutral ground at Fenwick's western estate. Fenwick, whose name was in the compact and who had chosen, when the documentation arrived at his gate, to open the gate rather than defend it, which was its own category of cowardice and its own category of survival. And Seraphine had decided to accept it because acceptance was cheaper than a siege, and the Empire had already paid more than enough for what it had bought. Draven came with 4 attendants and no ceremony, which was the right call, and she noted it as such, the specific intelligence of a man who understood that arriving with ceremony and defeat was an insult to the people you were surrendering to. He was thinner than she remembered. The performing strength quality she had watched collapse over 8 months had resolved into something else. Something that looked more like the actual man underneath the performance, which was neither as terrible nor as good as she had feared. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing in a field in late autumn with dead grass under frost, and the sky the particular gray of a season closing. And there was nothing between them. No throne, no court, no architecture of power that required managing. Just 2 people who had known each other for 6 years, one of whom had broken something fundamental between them, standing in the specific and irreversible aftermath of that breaking. Seraphine, he said. Draven, she said. He looked at the ground for a moment. She thought he was going to say something that required the ground for preparation, and she waited, and when he looked up, his face had the quality of a man who had arrived at a version of himself he did not entirely recognize. I knew the signature was forged, he said. I know, she said. I told myself I didn't. I know that too. He breathed out hard. That's worse, isn't it? Yes, she said, without softening it. He had asked for the honest answer, and he deserved it, and she was past the stage of managing his comfort. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not the love she had once known in it, that had been a different version of both of them, and the version was gone, but was something related to it. Something that lived in the same part of a person, the part that kept the record of what you had genuinely felt and could not revise regardless of what you had done afterward. The boy, he said. She was still. I found out from Vorin's documentation, Draven said, when Kaywin's letters arrived. I read the full record. He paused. He's mine. He's mine, she said. He's also yours. Both things are true and the order matters. His jaw worked. I'm not going to fight you about this, she said. I'm also not going to pretend it is uncomplicated. He exists. He is safe. What happens next depends entirely on who you decide to be for the next 20 years, which is a decision you have not yet made and I cannot make for you. He looked at her with the full weight of it. The specific gravity of a man who had lost everything and found, in the losing, the one thing that could not be lost after all. The one thread connecting him to something real. "I want to do it right," he said, quietly, with a rawness that she recognized as genuine because performed rawness had a quality of shaping that she could detect, and this had no shaping, just the unprocessed sound of a man arriving at a truth too late and choosing to arrive anyway. "Then do it right," she said. "That's what doing it right looks like. Not the declaration, the decision." She paused. "And then the next decision, and the one after that." He nodded once. She turned to walk back to where Kaelor was waiting at the tree line, 20 meters away, close enough to move if the meeting required it, far enough to allow the meeting its own space. And she thought, that is what it looks like. That specifically. The man who knows when to hold ground and when to hold back. She thought, I spent 6 years married to a man who never understood the difference. She thought, and here I am. The consolidation took 8 months. Not because the political structure was complicated, it was, but complication was manageable with sufficient organization. But because the human structure was, which was always the actual work, and always took longer than the maps suggested it would. Voron's documentation was thorough and devastating. 3 Casimir family members faced formal council proceedings. Lord Fenwick's estate was restructured under a caretaker appointment until his surviving sons were old enough to petition for restoration, which Seraphine had specified must remain available because she had decided she was not in the business of punishing bloodlines for the sins of their fathers, which was the specific cycle she was trying to break rather than perpetuate. Evelise vanished before the formal proceedings reached her name. Seraphine had expected this. She had built the proceedings knowing it was likely, and she had built them anyway because the record mattered regardless of whether the subject was present to hear it, because the record was not for Evelise. It was for the 7 allied houses and the outer provinces, and the soldiers at understaffed garrisons, and the merchants on burned trade routes, and the boy of 19 who had delivered a message from a field and been hanged for it. The record was for them. She received word of Evelise's disappearance on a Tuesday, which was not ironic except that it was, completely, and she sat with the irony for approximately 30 seconds, and then she set it down and went back to work. Walked. The morning she brought her son to Varenth for the first time, there was snow coming in from the north. He was walking. She had missed him learning to walk, which was a cost she had accepted at the time of choosing and had known she was accepting and had paid anyway because it was the only payment that kept him safe. And accepting it had not made the paying easier, it had just made it possible. He walked across the outer yard of Varenth with the specific focused determination of a child encountering new terrain, both hands slightly out for balance, his face wearing the expression she had carried in her memory for 8 months. The expression of a person discovering that the world was larger and more interesting than previously available evidence suggested. She crouched down in the snow. He looked at her. He did not hesitate. Children that age did not have the architecture of hesitation yet. They moved toward warmth and familiar things, with indirectness that adults spent decades learning to replicate and mostly couldn't. He walked into her arms and she held him, and she breathed, and in the breathing was everything. The 8 months and the goblet and the mud and the frontier cold and the ruins of Greyhorn Pass and Mira's fist against her skirt and 40 lords looking at the floor and Aldrich's last rider pointing in a direction and Voron's face doing its quiet accounting and Draven's jaw working at the council table. All of it. And then him. Warm and present and entirely uninterested in any of the preceding history. She held him for a long time. When she looked up, Kaelor was standing in the entrance to the citadel. He had given her the yard deliberately, the way he gave her space for everything that required it, not from distance, but from the specific intelligence of a man who had learned the difference between presence and intrusion, and deployed that intelligence constantly and without calling attention to it. He was watching her with the unguarded look that still appeared on his face sometimes, the one that broke through the still patient surface when she was not looking at him directly, and he thought the latitude was available. She had begun to let him think the latitude was available because she had found she wanted to see it, and what she wanted and what she permitted herself had gradually been converging into the same thing. She stood. She walked to him with her son on her hip. Kaelor looked at the child with the specific expression of a man encountering the concrete evidence of everything that had been at stake, and was now, unexpectedly, present and safe and looking at him with wide empirical eyes. Her son reached out one hand and grabbed Kaelor's coat lapel. Kaelor looked down at the hand. Something moved in his face. The particular movement of a person whose defensive architecture is encountering something it was not built to resist because it was not built for this category of thing, this small and unceremonious and completely overwhelming category of thing. "He has your eyes," Kaelor said. "He has his own eyes," she said. "He'll decide what to do with them." Kaelor looked at her. She looked at him. She thought, this is not a fairy tale. This is not a throne recovered or an enemy defeated or a power restored to its rightful position. This is something that does not have a clean name in the available vocabulary. A woman who went into the fire with nothing and came out the other side different in every layer, carrying the specific knowledge that survival at that temperature changes the material you are made of permanently. And standing now in the snow outside a fortress in the Black Mountains, next to a man who had looked at her and seen exactly what she was, and a child who had no idea what any of it meant and was currently trying to eat Kaelor's lapel, she thought, this is what it is, exactly this, not more and not less. She thought, it is enough. She reached out and took Kaelor's hand, not dramatically, not as a declaration, just the simple and specific physical act of two people choosing proximity. The same act she had seen performed 1,000 times in courts and corridors and had dismissed as gesture, and now understood was not gesture at all, but the fundamental unit of how people built things that lasted, which was choosing, repeatedly, in the small, ordinary moments, to be where the other person was. His hand closed around hers. In the citadel above them, the garrison was going about its day. In the outer provinces, the reconstruction was underway. In 7 allied houses, lords were reading correspondence and making decisions and revising their understanding of which direction the empire was moving. In a farmhouse in Ashenmere, a woman named Dara was doing ordinary things in the ordinary world that ordinary people got to do when the extraordinary business was finished. The snow came in from the north, and Seraphine stood in it with her son on her hip, and her hand in Kaelor's hand, and the full weight of everything she had survived settled into her bones, not as damage, but as density. The specific gravity of a person who has been through the fire and come out the other side knowing, with the unshakable certainty of tested things, exactly what she was made of. She was not the woman who had stood beneath the throne dais with mud drying on silver silk. She was not the queen who had poured wine for the woman sleeping in her bed. She was not the exile who had collapsed in the ruins of Greyhorn Pass and chosen, in the cold dark, not to die. She was all of those women, compressed and tempered and transformed into something that carried the record of each of them without being defined by any one of them. She was the thing they had tried to remove and could not. She was the thing that survived. And standing in the snow outside the Black Mountain fortress she had walked into with nothing but 8 months of compressed intelligence and a decision made in the ruins of someone else's war, she finally understood what that meant. Not power, not triumph, not the satisfaction of watching the ones who had discarded her understand their mistake. Just this. The cold air and the warm child, and the hand that had closed around hers without condition and without performance, and the specific and irreplaceable knowledge that she had looked at the worst version of her own life and refused to let it be the final one. The snow came down. The Empire, behind them, was learning to breathe again. And in the yard of Varenth, the most dangerous woman in the known world stood in the ordinary morning and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, simply be still.